Good evening and welcome to the Brontë Lounge. It's lovely to have you with us on the 208th anniversary of Branwell Bronte's birth. And what better person to be joining me tonight than Dean de la Motte, author of Oblivion, The Lost Diaries of Branwell Brontë, which explores the life of this often overlooked Brontë sibling. Dean, welcome to the Brontë Lounge. Where are you joining us from?
I am joining you from Metz in the Lorraine near Luxembourg in Germany, in northeastern France.
How very glamorous. Well, welcome. So tonight is all about Branwell. In fact, I am wearing my Team Branwell badge, which unfortunately is in the reduced section of the Brontë.
Oh, no.
Can you actually believe that? Well, I'm very proud of my badge. So when did you first discover the Brontes? Let's go right back.
Probably in high school, but certainly in college. I started as an English major before becoming a comparatist and doing a lot of French. Certainly read, like most people who did literary studies, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. And then it was much later when I was a young professor and I was preparing a class where I was pairing works of fiction with works of history. And it was called Writing the 19th Century. And in the context of preparing for that class, I read Juliet Barker's, the first edition of her massive biography of the Brontes, and learned all about Branwell. I really didn't know anything at all. I'm not even sure I knew he existed. And I immediately felt, and this may shock some people, but I felt a sort of a kindred spirit with him, and fascinated by him. And the idea evolved pretty quickly because as a teenager, I wanted to write novels, and then it became, practically speaking, not what I chose to do, but it was a desire nevertheless that I had, and a kind of frustration. And that's something that's a through line in the Brontes, all of them. As famous as the sisters became, they certainly, it took a lot of determination on their part, which is, I think, something he lacked. He had a number of flaws, and that's one of them. He sort of felt he should be famous immediately without having to. I mean, you see that in some of his, adolescent letters to famous poets and so forth. But I just became fascinated by him and had the idea for the book and even the title of the book early on. So this is almost 30 years ago now. And then I went into academic administration, and I never stopped reading up on Branwell and the Brontes, and never stopped wanting to write the book. But I was very busy being a dean and then an academic vice president. I did not have time for that kind of project. So once I left administration in 2014, I said, I don't deserve to live if I don't just jump. I had a whole sabbatical plus a summer where nothing was expected of me except to make the transition back to faculty. And I just decided I was going to sit down and write every day.
Well, we're very, very glad you did. I absolutely loved the book, all 700 plus pages of it. Absolutely. Now, we've just talked about the genesis of the book, but I'm really interested in the form. So this is Branwell's fictitious diaries. We don't know if he wrote diaries, but there's certainly no particular evidence. But why did you choose that particular form? I mean, it's so brilliant because I feel like I'm right there inside his head.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had an easy answer, but I will tell you that I always had the idea of incorporating his own writing into it. And he did write, there's the Blood and Foot notebooks, and lots of letters, not as many as Charlotte, obviously, but his correspondence, especially to Leyland and his sisters. So I felt, I don't know, it just sort of evolved that way. I decided really from the beginning. I wasn't sure if I was going to make it third person or first person, and I don't know, within just the first week of playing around and beginning the book, I decided to do it as the journals. And that allowed me to be very rigorous with, at least me, I'm kind of a linear person anyway, but to be very rigorous with the factual architecture of the book, the structure, which is, as Bronte fanatics and Bronte scholars will see if they read the book, something I'm very proud of is that I don't take liberties with. I mean, there are a couple of things where you might be able to go out and spend an enormous amount of time to prove that a certain thing didn't happen. But I've done my best to be consistent with what we know about Branwell's life and the sisters, and to place them where they should be at that exact time, based on different biographies I've read, and especially based on their correspondence and other writing. So.
Well, Andrea echoes my feelings. She says she absolutely adored it. It's the longest book she's ever read, but never wanted it to end, which I thought is rather lovely.
That's the best compliment you can get.
Absolutely. So you've talked a bit about being faithful there, but I wanted to know, what is fact and fiction, and how did you decide what to embroider? Obviously, it's a rich wellspring of information. I'm just interested.
Well, it's quite organic, and so it's hard to answer that question, except to say that I did what I think anyone who writes a book of any kind has to do, and sit down and do the work, right? And then I had an enormous amount of, well, I did a lot of the writing of the book here in France. So I wasn't able to bring all of my secondary sources with me, but I had a lot of that in my head. And then, of course, the internet, you can confirm just about anything. I had Barker's biography in a Kindle format. I have both editions they're still full of Post-its and highlighting. And I also had a Kindle version, so I did read it and highlight it at least 3 times, so I could refer back to that. But as I progressed, I would look at what he was writing at the time, or what was happening in his life. Was he working for the railway? Was he a tutor? Was he unemployed? What was he writing? What do we know about him? And we know quite a bit compared to other people in history, even though he's the so-called forgotten Bronte. We do know a lot. And so what I tried to fill in based on his poetry and his letters was what he was actually feeling, because it's very much in the spirit of the Bronte sisters novels that are often written in the first person, certainly, in what those characters are feeling, whether it's Helen in The Tenant with that very long diary of hers that is sort of dropped into the middle of the correspondence of her future second husband, or Jane Eyre, which is the wonderful, the example of a first person narrative, and even Wuthering Heights, as complex as it is in terms of the narrative, it's, in a sense, all of the different characters are narrating in the first person, but then they're embedded within different, this complex sort of puzzle of narratives. But I just it was the feelings, and it's the little things that happen in Branwell's life from day to day. I tried to hang on. It's kind of like being taken downstream and grabbing onto a bush or a twig or a branch that would have been, what actually happened to him, and the rest of it was the kind of free flowing of my imagination and having immersed myself in the language of the Brontes. One thing that's a little kind of fun bit of trivia is, when I decided to write the book, I was still teaching full time. I was in North Carolina, and I had a long commute in my little car. And I listened to the audio recordings, books of the works of the Bronte sisters, not just once, but over and over and over, as it saturated my brain with their turns of phrase. And so when I sat down to write, I had that. And even when I was writing in France, particularly the first half of the book, it says about the first half of the book, I would read the Brontes. And that's probably what I was reading at the time is somewhat reflected in what I draw from in my writing. But I would go to sleep, I would see friends during the day. I was living in France, speaking French, but the only English I was hearing was Bronte English. So I was going to sleep, reading Wuthering Heights, and then waking up and starting to write first thing. So it was pretty fanatical, intense experience that I don't think I'll replicate again. And I look at the book now, and not just the size of it, but kind of the intensity of the work done. And it was a lot.
I hope you kept a dream diary, because I would imagine it kept on fermenting overnight with all of
Yeah,
that.
I didn't keep a dream diary. Everything went into the book, but it was quite an experience.
So there you are in North Carolina. You're saturated with Bronte. Did you come out? When did you come over to England? What were the research trips?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So most of it was the written word. I did not get to Haworth for the first time until 2016. And I had written, oh gosh, 4/5 of the book already. I was coming into, so I had spent a fall semester plus a summer writing the first half or so. The following summer, I was back in the States and I wrote another chunk. And so that summer of 2016 is when I went to France. And before I went to France, I spent a week or two in Yorkshire. And so I was able to sort of walk some of the streets, um, and go to Scarborough and get a feel and go to York and go to York Minster, which, if you may recall, there was a couple of notable scenes there. So all of that, and so that was kind of the feeling much better. I did a lot of things, obviously looking at Google Earth and tracing paths and roads. And then as the book was really getting ready for publication, I was, and he might be out there, but Colin Robertshaw, who's up in Broughton, after I reached out to this local sort of, it's a group of small historical societies, a kind of confederation, and they sent out on their listserv some questions that I had to try to figure out some of the things that happened at the beginning of the book. Just get a little more specificity on the places that Branwell worked and the topography and who he might have slept with and who he might have fathered a child with and all of this. And Colin Robertshaw was sent back this response, which was just amazing. And that really helped shape the first, I don't know if it's 100 pages, but the first chunk of the book is much more accurate than it would be otherwise. So that's some kind of last minute. And Ann Dinsdale helped me with some street names in Haworth, as the book was practically about ready to go into the final proof stage. So there were lots of people who helped, trying to think of what else. But yeah, most of it was composed through secondary and primary works of the Brontes, and then using visual things I could find on the internet, and then different books about the Brontes, including their paintings and drawings and so forth. So I hope that answers the question.
It absolutely does, very comprehensively. So I think you've whet our appetite. And in the words of Marina in the chat, one of the best books about Branwell ever written. We would like to hear a reading, if we may.
Oh, my goodness. That's very kind. I have a couple, and I'm going to try to keep them. And I have to confess, because I'm traveling and because my book, as those of you who've read it or purchased it or both know, weighs a ton. And so my copies are back in Lyon and in Newport, but I have a PDF. So I am going to read a brief excerpt from an relatively early chapter. It's still 250 pages in, but this is from a chapter called in this section of the book when he's working. He's just gotten promoted on the railway, and there are 2 or 3 chapters that really deal with his crisis of faith. And I have this, and I say this as someone who grew up in a very religious family and is not particularly religious, or certainly not practicing. I have a very fluid, pantheistic, more of an Emily Bronte relationship with religion. But anyway, I think his growing up in the parsonage, but there's a lot of evidence that he really didn't accept at least the kind of institutional Church of England faith of the rest of the family, and certainly of his father. That this is a source of crisis for him, and fear, but also rebellion. And I think it's connected in some ways to his his other problems, including addiction and so forth, because I think all of us as humans, we have this sort of desire to transcend, right? To get out of ourselves, to feel godlike, whatever that might be. And at any rate, in this chapter, which is called "Who Then Is My God," there's a little bit of music on that, and I'm going to keep it down to just a couple of paragraphs. And here he's talking about what he's done in the last year, and he says, "In the essential, has anything changed? Still, I long for a situation that allows me to devote my time to writing. Still, I am harried by the eternal need for money. Still, I go through each day in quiet fury at the world's hypocrisy, baseness, and cupidity. Still, I feel, especially within the company of Leyland," and that, as most of you know, is his friend, Francis Leyland, the sculptor, "when in the company of Leyland, like blotting out all such cares until I feel nothing more. As for the softer sex, am I not worse off than I was a year ago? For I have not only lost Agnes and failed to gain Maggie, I now have no prospects for such affection. Alas, it is far worse to have felt such bliss and have it brutally withdrawn than it is to be ignorant of its very existence, as I was before I arrived in Brontë last January. For now I have within me an aching, craving desire that often knows no bounds. How strange that the same man, when viewed solely through his conduct, can be seen to progress on an upward arc, as if calmly and steadily climbing a hill towards his ultimate goal, while in the depths of his heart, he spirals downward into a personal hell, one mostly of his own making. Is concordance of the two ever possible? I am certain Papa would have something to say about the matter, and he would counsel a number of things, all equally impossible for me to put into action. Crush any last desires I have to make my living solely through writing, put my faith in God and follow his teachings. I can fairly hear him now. If we love God and wish to serve him, let us try to be like him, to do his work, to labor for his glory, etc., etc. Most men of faith have moments of doubt, but I am the man of doubts who occasionally has moments of faith. What I mean to say is that to me, God is something of a trickster. Although nowhere do I see demonstrable evidence of his existence, everywhere is his name loudly proclaimed, either in impious oaths or, as at the parsonage and in Papa's clerical circles, at times with great fervor and sincerity, and at others with simpering hypocrisy. A rather impressive feat, I must admit. Indeed, doubt of his existence is not openly permitted, except by those of such wealth or renown that they can be indifferent to the usual censure of society. As I reflect, it is not that I harbor such doubts either. Rather, it is that I refuse to believe in that, quote, pale version of Zeus, as Leyland called him. This is something he's quoted Leyland from an earlier conversation. I have just a little bit more of this passage. Meanwhile, the Reverend Paley and his ilk claim that God is a simple watchmaker who has wound up his elegant timepiece and walked away, refusing to occupy himself with our day-to-day affairs. Others, on the contrary, believe he is like an overprotective mother, keeping watch over her young children, and that all of the good that we do and suffer must be the direct result of his divine intervention. Of course, questions of the origin of evil, free will, and so forth soon arise to muck up the works. And how silly, really, to believe that the Divine One spends his time shaping each cloud and snowflake, deciding which horse will fall and break its leg, or which child will have green eyes and which blue. Stuff and nonsense. And I'm skipping a paragraph to the final one. Who then is my God? He is the one we cannot name and cannot grasp, and will only know when our life's day fades. He is not stooping over and deciding our every act, but he is in everything that is bright and beautiful and good. The roaring fire in the hearth of a wintry eve, a warm breeze as it shimmers through the green leaves of an oak tree on a spring day, and the ever-shifting Dudden sands as much as the eternal Blackcomb that towers nearby. He is in the innocent frolicking of children, in the tender healing kiss of a mother on her baby's feverish cheek, in the hand of a young woman as she slowly brushes her ringlets back from her fair forehead, and in the fire that is kindled between two passionate souls as their bodies arc together as one in ardent earthly rapture. It is the face of God that shines out through human genius of all kinds, whether it's Leyland's Head of Satan or Franz Liszt's Mephisto Waltz. God is in Stevenson's locomotive, in Brunel's bridges and tunnels, and Cook and Wheatstone's telegraph. Most of all, though, he is hidden, concealed until the end of time, or at least until the shadow of death descends ineluctably on each of us one by one. To presume to know his exact shape is a piece of arrogant folly that should itself qualify the doctrinaire among us for the flames of hell. If such a place existed, such creeds are worthless as withered weeds, which this audience will know is stolen from Emily Bronte's famous poem. So that's an example of sort of taking the temperature of where Branwell was at the time, but also putting a whole lot of my thinking into it, and then the language of the Brontes where I could. How are we doing for time, Helen?
We're doing brilliantly for time. We're at 10 to 8, so we've got another 40 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to cut the second one. I'm going to make short, but I want to give you a flavor for a different sort of passage. Let me see. Because I want us to have plenty of time for discussion. That's always my favorite part of this. So I'm being selfish. Well, let me see. Now we're going to go to the end. This is part of Branwell's life that people know much more about. Okay. He's lost his job, his final job. Make sure I got the right. Okay. Here we go. So now he's at home. If you've seen the brilliant Sally Wainwright film To Walk Invisible, which most people in this crowd will have seen, which, by the way, they were filming when I went to Haworth for the first time, and it was kind of fun because the people I met with, including Anne at the Parsonage, said, "Did you know they're filming up on Penistone Hill?" So I went up, and it was interesting to see. I didn't know the actresses at the time, but see them walking around between takes on their cell phones, but in period dress. That was fun. And to be able to tell my students about that, which my students have since watched every time I teach the Bronte course, that we watch that film. So it was so fun to be finishing my work. And my take on Branwell at this time is very consistent with Sally Wainwright's. All right. So this is the scene, or the moment, and it's captured some briefly in Sally Wainwright's film, in fact, where we think Branwell discovered the proofs of the poems by the Bronte sisters. So we're in the actual date here is 1846, March. This is him. I thought it'd be good to have you sort of see or hear a passage where the sisters are involved. And it's hard because those chapters are few and far between, but they're quite long. So this is one where he says, I'm skipping a little bit from the beginning, I discovered the page proofs of a volume called quite simply Poems by Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. So they had finally done it, although it was clear from the enclosed correspondence that they had paid for the publication themselves. So what then? A publishing house would issue the scratchings of an ape if said primate had enough money to pay for it. Had I Aunt Branwell's inheritance to fling to the wind, I too could put a volume of Northanglerland's verse into print. After all, I'd written as much publishable verse as the three of them combined, and published no small amount of it already. Nevertheless, I flipped feverishly through the stack of proofs. I saw some good, even brilliant things, especially from the vigorous pen of Ellis Bell. In The Philosopher, I found the poem that I had heard Emily reciting. So there's an earlier scene where he eavesdrops more than once, but anyway, he's already heard part of this poem. And so now he says, I could know its ending. I ne'er had called oblivion blessed, nor stretching eager hands to death, implored to change for lifeless rest this sentient soul, this living breath, Oh, let me die, that power and will their cruel strife may close, and conquered good and conquering ill be lost in one repose. And so the earlier part of this poem is something I place at the beginning of the novel, in fact. Sphinx-like sister of mine, he goes on to say, though you may call it cowardly, you too understand my yearning for real rest. And that's the poem he's published recently on similar themes. And you, sweet Acton Bell, have written some lovely verse as well. You too see that, quote, in all we do and see and hear is restless toil and vanity, and that pleasure but doubles future pain, and joy brings sorrow in her train. But your solution is to trust God and keep his statutes still, upright and firm through good and ill. Do you not see, Anne, that without your fairy tale God, who obstinately refuses to speak a word or show his face, that all is indeed vanity, vanitas vanitatum et omnia vanitas, omnia. As I turned at last to Currer Bell's poems, and it occurs to me now that it is as significant that Charlotte placed hers first in the volume as it is that I perused them last, I heard voices and footsteps in the parsonage and tried in haste to wrap up the parcel of proofs so that they appeared untouched, but my trembling hands were unable to perform the task. And I'm just going to skip down to where he says at the end of this chapter, as with so many other things since we had grown up and apart, we were now apparently to feign that I had not seen the proofs and that my sisters had not written them. How wrong we are to believe that make-believe is solely the province of childhood. No, alas, it is not that pretending ends as we age, but that we fashion it carefully into an instrument of practical deceit. Even the world of imagination must submit to the inexorable logic of the utilitarian. And I could go on and on, but I really want to make sure that we have time for discussion.
Thank you, Dean. Those readings were beautiful. So obviously, as this is a webinar, I'm taking questions from the chat that I'm going to feed to you in response to our conversation. So Betsy, thanks you for an amazing book. You've obviously got lots of fans who've hoovered up this amazing book. She would like you to talk a little bit about foreshadowing. You insert it in various parts of the book. Did these occur to you as you wrote, or was this something you put in during a later revision?
That's a great question. Since I don't have an exact recording or journal, in fact, of what I did, I would say that because I had so this is where my friends who are not academics and my now wife here in France would say, can you just answer the question and not, but it's going to be fairly, there will be digressions. I'll keep it as brief as I can. I think because I had so much of Branwell's life in my head and I knew where this was going, as most of the people who would read this book know already about his life, that I was able to foreshadow consciously certain things that happened. But the book is so extensively revised and carefully revised that certainly there were changes to the beginning that appeared later. And one thing I will say that's it's not connected so much to foreshadowing is simply, when did I do certain things? I feel that I'd never written a novel before, and even though as you can be a literature professor and not be a writer. And it took some practice, and I think I got better as I went along. And so I think in the rewriting, I made the beginning better. I also shortened, I broke the chapters into shorter units, and I eliminated some. Believe it or not, as long as the book is, it was even longer. So there was a lot of work on both on the front end and the back end, I guess. There's not an easy answer for that one.
No, that's a great answer. And I love that idea of foreshadowing consciously, that because you knew, and you know that a lot of your readers will know that you could do that. And it really enhances the experience. It really does. It adds an extra something. Judith wanted, you talked a little bit about the beginning there. She wanted to know how you decided at which point in Branwell's life to begin the novel.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one thing I did not want to do was to write a book on something that had been covered in a number of biographies, which is essentially the time from usually the focus is on, and that's also the focus in Sally Wainwright's film, is from the time he loses his last real position at Thorpe Green to his death. And that part of it is first of all sad, but it's also sort of it's overcovered. It's too well known. And I was really interested, it's not just that, but I was really fascinated in how a hopeful, brilliant young man of 2022, I guess he's around 22 when the book begins, how he gets to that point, because you don't just get there overnight. You don't, even if you lose a job, even if you have a shocking affair with your employer's wife, even if you might drink a little bit too much, you don't suddenly collapse and spiral into complete decay and early death without something leading up to that. So I wanted to go back in time to when he was most hopeful as a young adult, to those years from 1840 to 1845, 46, 45, I guess. And most of the book, if you do a page count, which I've done, not to the exact page, but I would say we don't get to the part where he loses the job at Thorpe Green until 600, maybe even 650 pages into the book. So I foreshortened that last bit because it's very well known. And I also thought, as he spirals into alcoholism, and there's not a lot of it, despite what people have said since the time of the very first sort of reports of his behavior early on. Mrs. Gaskell's sort of getting second and third hand knowledge about him from people in the village and elsewhere. There's not a lot of concrete evidence about his drug use. There is a lot about his drinking. And so I just decided, because I'm familiar with drinking and not so much with drug use, I could draw on my own experience and be more accurate. So I just sort of made that choice but it could be either one. But the point is, as he spiraled into that, it made sense to me that he wouldn't be writing much and that it would be difficult to read. And so there's a suspension of disbelief that even at the end of the book, when he's supposed to be drunk or whatever, that I tried to keep the book as clean as possible in terms of spelling and punctuation. Just so that's a bit of a fiction, because we know from the final note, right, that we have that's included in the book, where he wanted some gin. We know that he was a mess, but I didn't want that to distract the reader from what was actually happening. So there's a bit of a convention there where he's always writing with great clarity, which probably wouldn't have been the case. But anyway, that was another reason to foreshorten those last few years, because 3 years. I just wasn't as interested in that, because to me, whatever happened to him that was so damaging happened before. And of course, a lot of this, I think, goes back, a lot of what's good and traumatic about the Brontes generally as a unit is, of course, the childhood trauma of losing their mother and their sisters. So that's the real trauma that I deal with a little bit in the book as well, especially at the very end when he has a dream. He has an opium-induced dream, actually, but it's Dr. Wheelwright who gave him the opium to sleep, not. So, and Sally Wainwright has a very different dream in her film, but she also uses that experience when he almost burned down the parsonage to use a dream. But I have him dreaming. He's just read the sisters' books, which Charlotte claimed he never had, but I decided why not? And I'm not the only one who's used that convention to say, well, what would he think? I had my students once the book came out, I had them read that chapter. And they said, some of them said, well, Dr. Delamotte, that his take on the book sounds suspiciously like your take on the books. And I said, oh, this is a surprise. So it's really just me. It's talking about the book there.
So returning to his voice, you've just talked very beautifully about the period that you've chosen and why you chose that particular chapter section in his life. But in terms of his voice, I know obviously you said you'd listened and immersed yourself in the sounds of the book, the words of the sisters' books, but his voice, it's a very likable human voice. He is the kind of guy that you would have been entertained by and possibly attracted to. How did you sort of distill the essence of him into the voice that we read across those many pages?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of me there. There's a lot of his sort of his playful humor that we get in his letters to his friends, sometimes quite puerile, adolescent humor, but nevertheless, having grown up and knowing what men can be like in their late teens and early 20s, it was easy to imagine conversations with. And most of my friends in high school, for example, yes, they liked to party, but they also were sort of budding intellectuals who like to talk about ideas. And so the voices that come through, for example, when he is with his friends, that is it's a very different kind of conversation that. And I also wanted to emphasize that's just how different. I think it's much less the case today. I hope so anyway in 2025. But at the time, there were these separate spheres, right, that they call them. And the boys being boys in the tavern or the pub would have been very different, the very same people as they would turn around and go up to the parsonage and speak to the sisters and to the Reverend Brontë, and it would have been a very different kind of discourse. So I also wanted to have fun in capturing not just his voice, but his voices, to illustrate that sort of the different spheres in which men and women traveled. And there's some reflection on that, which is it can be a little bit anachronistic in the sense that I give him a little bit of a conscience in terms of the way women are objectified. And there's a scene where Anne talks about this and says, it's one of actually the scenes with just Branwell and Anne were some of my favorites to write. And anyone who reads it carefully will see that even though it sounds silly, but Anne is, I have a love affair with Anne Brontë, at least as she she's based partly on Agnes Grey. So there's this weird double mirroring effect where the autobiographical Agnes Grey was the inspiration for my version of Anne Brontë. But that whole question of voice, I was also trying to do that. I mean, I'm digressing. I told you. But, so Anne inspires, Agnes inspires Anne, and Jane Eyre to some extent inspires Charlotte. But Charlotte wrote so much and so much correspondence, and we know so much about her. And she's not portrayed in a terribly flattering way in my book, but I think I'm fair based on what we know about her. I don't think it's mean-spirited. And it's certainly consistent, for example, and I'd written the book by the time Sally Wainwright's film came out, but it's very, very consistent with the way she's portrayed in To Walk Invisible, for example, which is you love and admire her, but you also find her peevish and difficult and angry, but you understand why she's angry, right? So anyway, I tried to capture the different voices based on what we knew about the Brontes, but also about the characters that they themselves created that were mirrors of themselves. But with Branwell, I just got into a rhythm, and I say a lot about it in the afterword, but in terms of finding the right kind of language, I don't think I always do it, but people have been very complimentary on how the book is it's obviously more modern than a novel by the Brontes, but I wanted it to be a book the Brontes, and they might be shocked or they might hate it, but the Brontes would pick it up and they wouldn't find a single word that they wouldn't understand. I wanted it to be something that would overlap with the vocabulary. And their vocabulary, the more I read from the 19th century, the more I realize how modern and probably influential in that way, they're vigorous their writing is. I mean, it's pretty remarkable because you read some of their contemporaries and it's just tough going.
Well, there's an interesting question here from Alison. Do you think that Branwell found Haworth and the parsonage and the environment very stultifying? And Alison wonders if he might have been more comfortable in a freer artistic environment, pre-Raphaelites, realists, impressionists, a world where self-expression and behavior and codes of conduct, you know, became all a little bit more fluid.
I think so. And I don't want to change the subject immediately, but one of the things that is related directly to this is, I think if he had had more courage, because there's a kind of weakness there that I can also relate to, although maybe I haven't, you know, for example, that I chose when I was 19 or 20 to spend a year in France. Obviously it was easier for me than it would have been for Branwell, but Branwell was not a great risk taker. He was, in terms of, he was a risk taker with sort of, I don't know, self-destructive behavior, yes, but for example, he probably could have said, let me go to Paris and let me just figure it out, or even let me try London, you know, the debate about whether he ever went at all, but or let me go to Edinburgh, or and he always seemed to want to stay within a comfort zone and not really break away into another environment where he would be free to. Because I don't know the answer, but I think I think his love, he had a love-hate relationship with Haworth and with the parsonage and with his own family, and so he was afraid to break entirely with them. But he loathed himself for being so dependent upon them, I think, and that's treated at length in the book, particularly at the end. But again, I shortened the end as much as I could so that I didn't think anyone needed to slog through hundreds of pages of I mean, there's already a lot of self-loathing and self-doubt in the book. That's sort of the nature of Branwell. But as it gets worse and worse, I didn't want to focus on that. So I did my best to keep the last 150 pages or so moving along, even though he's falling apart.
Well, the whole book moves along. For a book that long, you often have longer. There weren't any longer in there. I'm absolutely fascinated that 4/5 of this book was written, you know, before you even went to Haworth. And Vicky wonders whether the voice you heard or the world you had whipped up for yourself changed in any way after your visit to Haworth and the parsonage.
Let's see. I certainly changed some things, and I didn't walk. I spent 3 or 4 days, and I walked up to Top Withens, and I walked quite a bit. Spent time on the moors. I think I certainly changed and added some things based on that. I think over time I refined some of the speech of the common folks, the Yorkshire, but I have to confess, and if you read the afterword, you'll see I admit this, but I have to confess that was as much based on TV series, also by Sally Wainwright and that sort of thing, that I wasn't going to have characters speak the way Joseph does in Wuthering Heights, because I've taught that book. I've read it I don't know how many times, and I've taught it at least 9 times, and I still have to go back to the notes at the back of the edition to know what the heck Joseph is saying. So I didn't want it to be that hard, but I did want there to be the authenticity of certain characters. So that was something I was careful about. I didn't want to overdo it, and maybe I did at times, but I tried. And there's an Irish character or two, and I tried to be faithful there. But yeah, it certainly changed things on the surface. I'm not sure, and this is a big debate, and I'm going to go out. I'm going to go out on a limb here, quite literally. I've been to Haworth now twice, and I can't wait to get back. And I don't think one can fully appreciate the Brontes without having been there. So let me say that first. But after I've said that, I think people around the world, most of whom will never make it to Yorkshire or to Haworth, love the Brontes because the Brontes are a part of world literature because their themes are universal. And for me to grow up in the 1970s in California, of all places, and to be able to connect to the emotions expressed by the characters in the works of the Brontes, who, by the way, this is something I talk about with my students who are all around 18 years old because it's a first year seminar. Almost all the characters in the major works of the Brontes are around 18 years old. And I find this, well, Wuthering Heights, there it's going over several, obviously, but there's sort of this key moment, this passage into adulthood, and particularly the limited choices that women face. But the difficulty, which I think the Brontes I know the Brontes all struggled with, the difficulty of passing from their wonderful child, despite the trauma, right? But their childhood play with one another, passing into adulthood and having to make a living, and making difficult choices, either refusing marriage offers or accepting them. And this bleeds through the works of the Brontes as well. It just fascinates me, and I continue to find it one of the most compelling and heartbreaking aspects of the Brontes. I mean, just two examples that reinforce each other, that echo each other, is the famous, as Catherine Earnshaw Catherine Linton is losing her mind after Heathcliff's come back. And she says, I wish I were a girl again, hardy and free, back at the Heights. And there's another line, a lesser known and lesser character, but when Rosalie Murray gets married and Agnes Grey goes to see her, excuse me, it's my cold acting up now. And she says to Agnes, oh, I wish I would give 1,000 worlds. I may be quoting this a little bit off, but I would give 1,000 worlds to be Miss Murray again. And she bursts into tears. And so this idea that we, all of us, only have one life, and that there are these, especially around the time of the entrance into adulthood, where we have to make these difficult decisions that pit our imagination and our passion, often, not always, and our love for not just other people, but for a way of life, against the hard realities of sustaining ourselves and being financially secure for a woman in the 1830s and 40s, for example. That is just something I find so universal. And that's just one example, but I'm here in France, and they are absolutely nuts about the Brontes here. And people, and the French are notorious is the wrong word, but they are famously well-read. But I'm surprised how many people have even heard of Branwell, but when they want to know what my book is about, for example. But the Brontes touch people, continue to touch people, even people who haven't been. They are also able to convey so much of the landscape, and Haworth in various forms, and Yorkshire more generally, in their works in a way that touches people. So I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but what I'm saying is I don't think you have to go there to find their works great.
They live within us, and it lives within us. The relationship between the siblings was incredibly complex, and obviously Branwell played such a pivotal role in terms of that nascent writing camaraderie, the spinning of the worlds. And whilst the girls obviously went through the same trauma, and grief. They seem to be more nourished by their writing, more resilient, and he didn't seem to ever get that succor, that creative nourishment. He always felt judged. He always felt second best. Ironic after what we've just said about patriarchal society. Why was it that the girls took so much sustenance from their practice, and he was so tormented and not resilient?
Oh gosh, if if you know that, if you can find that out, I have no idea. But I'll come up with something anyway. That's all these decades of teaching. If you just come up with something. I would say that this question, these are sort of there's a kind of web of questions here that are connected to this thorny issue, and I think part of it's related. It's this paradox. There's a patriarchy that's favoring this young man who's brilliant and who's treated differently, as all male children were, and yet, and there are plenty of people who rightly, including his own sisters, but today would also rightly say, "Boo-hoo," cry me a river. So I get that, but I do think just the combination of the expectations placed on him because he was the male, and his particular personality. I can't say it any other way than that. His flaws, his character flaws, was just a toxic mix. He had the very sort of, I don't know, in a strange way, he had what now maybe today we would call, and this is very controversial, but certainly he had feminine qualities, right? I mean, he was an artist, he was a literary figure, he was deeply feeling. I mean, these are cliches about gendered language about this, but he wasn't the he wasn't the Stevenson type who was going to be born into illiteracy and become a millionaire as a railway titan. He just didn't, and he talks about people like that and he admires them, but he doesn't have he knows from the beginning that he doesn't have the ability to focus and to be dogged and persistent. That it may slip under the radar, but he talks about that very early on in the book. He says, "How happy are people?" And he mentions, I don't think he mentions Stevenson at that point, but he mentions, oh shoot, I read his name, the Brunel, the engineer. He mentions Brunel, and he says, "How happy men whose dreams are consistent with what the world is asking of them." And famously or infamously, he wants to be a poet at the very moment that poetry is becoming is passing out of fashion, and certainly is not marketable. And it's the rise of the novel at that very moment. And of course, he puts that in a famous letter that I use, but Sally Wainwright also uses in a scene in To Walk Invisible, when he says, "I've decided there's no money in poetry." And Charlotte says, "Well, do you have a story?" And he says, "Well, when have I not had a story?" But he didn't have the ability to sit down and just do the work and write. And if those of you out there who've read his fragment, "And the weary are at rest," now this is very subjective what I'm about to say, but I think it's terrible. It's just unreadable. So he published some fine poems, I think, and I do think he was brilliant. But he didn't have. So I definitely don't. I'm going to back up a little bit. One of the things as I began to write the book that I was interested in doing was making him complex, and if not likable, making him someone we could all relate to as a human being, and making him three-dimensional. Because it seems to me there are historically been these two camps, right? That he's either the misunderstood genius, so along with the sainted Brontë sisters, he's this kind of In French, you would say a poet maudit, right? He's a damned poet, like Chatterton, or like some other Baudelaire later in France. So sort of the doomed poet. And he's misunderstood, but he was a genius. And if things had been different, we'd have this great body of work. And then at the other end of the spectrum, people just think he's a dirtbag. He's an alcoholic. He's maybe a womanizer, maybe a drug addict, lazy, a liar. And he certainly was some of those things. He certainly had addictive behavior, but that addictive behavior is something I really tried to put in the frame in the larger context of the times, and his kind of romantic impulses, romantic in the sense of the literary sense, and for us to find him, and many people will find him unlikable rather in my book, but tried to make him less of a caricature and more of a human being that connected to the real Branwell. I don't know if the real Branwell would recognize this character. It might be more me than it is the real Branwell, but that's hard to say.
So the cover, you can see, Angela's put it in the chat, it's the most beautiful illustration, but the title is beyond perfect. And Betsy says you first used the word oblivion on page 47. When did you decide that was going to be the title of the book? Because it's just perfect.
I have to say it was really from the beginning. I wrote a letter. This is back in the days of early, it was not quite email. Well, the email was around, but wasn't used. I wrote an old-fashioned letter to Juliet Barker, kind of a fan letter. I told her about my project. And I think when I wrote that, I already had the title of Oblivion. And the Oblivion came to me because, well, the common usage of drinking yourself into oblivion, which he often did, and the idea that Branwell has fallen into oblivion compared to his sisters. Not many people know about him, so there's that historical sense of oblivion, of being forgotten, and then even his famous painting of his sisters, of course, he painted himself into oblivion. And so all of these different sort of meanings of oblivion, it's a very rich word in English. It's interesting because I'm trying to get it translated into French. And I think we probably would, if we could succeed in getting it translated, keep the title Oblivion, but then the subtitle would be translated into French. Because in French, oblivion just says oubli, which it means forgetfulness, or that oubli is like something that is forgotten. And it's, to me, the English word has enormous richness, that when you say oblivion, it conjures up all sorts of things. Historical oblivion, as I said, the everyday use of the word oblivion, of someone getting obliterated. And so I decided that early on. And then the subtitle of The Lost Diaries, I really played with that. In fact, I came across one of the early drafts, and I had crossed out the secret diaries and changed it to The Lost. I just decided to keep it vague and not try to. The earliest version of the book had a prologue that takes place in the present day, where someone finds this and takes it to try to authenticate it at the parsonage. And it was fun to write, but I decided just to present it. It's obviously clearly a novel, and I'm calling it a novel, and I'm just presenting it as if it were his diaries. And people, I just decided I didn't need to have it found inside someone's wall or anything like that.
Well, along with me and countless members of the audience, thank you so much for tonight, Dean. I could talk to you for much, much longer, but we've run out of time. But for those of you who haven't read this amazing book, I do strongly urge you to read it. And it is available in the Brontë online shop. Angela's put a link in the chat.
It is.
Yes, please buy it. I'll be talking to Kathy Rensenbrink for the next Brontë Lounge, which will be in October. But before then, I'll be talking to our very own Brontë genii, Anne Dinsdale and Sharon Wright, about their fantastic new book, Let Me In, The Brontes in Bricks and Mortar, next month in Haworth. and in Bradford as part of this year's Bradford Literature Festival. And of course, there's the Brontë Festival of Women's Writing coming up. So much exciting Brontë activity to keep us inspired. So we hope to see you all over the summer, but our very special thanks to Dean, who has a bit of a cold and he's over in France, but he's been absolutely stellar company tonight. Thank you so much, Dean, and to all of you for joining us. Have a very lovely rest of the evening. Good night.
Thank you for your attention, everyone, and for reading the book. It's really gratifying. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Dean. Good night.